What do you think is the most disturbing unsolved mystery ever? Story 1. The Ibadan Forest of Horror in Nigeria. A local taxi driver goes missing, and his friends create a makeshift search party and investigate a forest. Instead of finding their friend, they find an abandoned school or factory that has the remnants of a hellish ritual. 8 survivors were rescued. Numerous body parts, rotting corpses, and personal artifacts were found. The perpetrators were never found, although local politicians and ritualists were suspects. Whilst this discovery is disturbing, the mystery for me is that the original taxi driver still hasn't been found. Story 2. I am an avid reader of unresolved mysteries, and I don't know why it has stuck with me, but Carly Goose, 16-year-old girl called her stepmother to pick her up from a party, reportedly was too scared to sleep because she thought someone would kill her, and the next day, she disappeared. There were some weird interviews and dynamics between step-parents and birth parents, and a bunch of theories surrounding that. Her father was just arrested for corporal injury to his spouse. No further details have been released, but that's a pretty scary charge. Seems like dad has anger issues, and stepmom dislikes the girl. Her poor mother. Story 3. The Disappearance of Zeb Quinn. He was 18 years old when he went missing in 2000, was working his shift at a local Walmart, and afterwards wanted to look at a new car with a colleague, when he allegedly received a call that made him take off frantically. After that, he was never seen again. The strangest thing is that a few days later, his car was found in a parking lot, with the headlights turned on, a pair of lips and an exclamation mark drawn on the back window in pink lipstick, and a live Labrador puppy sitting inside. In 2017, the colleague was arrested for his murder, but all the strange details still make no sense at all. Story 4. The Disappearance of Lars Maack, a German man who went on vacation in Bulgaria in 2014. He was last seen at the airport, where he was brought into a private room by airport security after his mother had called, telling them her son was behaving strangely, saying there were people after him over the phone the night before. A few minutes later, he's seen bolting, and I mean full-on sprinting out of the room without his luggage. He ran out of the airport, scaled the huge fences around the perimeter, and was never seen or heard from again. Hundreds of witnesses, CCTV footage, and a police presence, and the man still basically disappeared off the face of the earth in broad daylight. Story 5. Jessica Chambers. She was set on fire in her car and had gasoline poured down her throat. Paramedics found her walking down the lane on fire. The only part of her body that wasn't burned was the bottom of her feet. She did not survive. Police found a suspect, but didn't have enough evidence to charge him. Paramedics were so traumatized by what they saw, they had to go through therapy and broke down on stage during interviews. She tried to name her attacker, but her throat was so destroyed, she couldn't be understood. Story 6. Missy Bevers. A suspect in full SWAT armor breaks into a church and smashes windows and breaks open doors with a hammer, looking for a local fitness instructor. They then find and beat her to death before getting away. There is high-quality surveillance video of both them and their car, but investigators couldn't make out the license plate. There has been a suspect who was cleared because of an alibi, and there's been no recent updates. Story 7. As a diver, I find the disappearance of McDaniels to be super interesting. They say he went into a cave and never came out, but some of the world's top cave divers looked for him and never found a body. The only evidence that he went diving were staged gas bottles, but they were filled with normal air, not any sort of mixture or anything. The owner of Vortex Springs, where Ben went missing, also died mysteriously the year after. Story 8. The Murder of Lindsay Buzik. A case close to home for me that I don't see mentioned as much as it should be. A relatively junior realtor in Victoria, British Columbia, is showing a luxury home to some clients, and the clients her. The clients, a man and a woman, cold called her, saying they needed to find something to buy ASAP. She was apprehensive of showing the property by herself and asked that her boyfriend come or wait outside or something. Turns out the boyfriend was running late and arrived around the same time the murder was occurring, but I don't believe he saw anything, as the suspects fled through the back door. It's believed that she was also the victim of a professional hit or some unknown reason. Also, the cell phone that was used to contact her was purchased by someone with an alias in Vancouver 6 or so months prior and was only ever used to contact her. Story 9. Las Cruces Bowling Alley. In February 1990, in Las Cruces, New Mexico, 2 intruders entered the bowling alley through an unlocked door before opening time. The cook, Ida Hulgan, was forced by one gunman to go to the office where Stephanie Maack, her 12-year-old daughter Melissa Repass, and Melissa's 13-year-old friend Amy Hauser were being held by the other gunmen. The women and girls were forced to lie on the ground while the gunmen stole $4,000 to $5,000 from a safe. The alley's pen mechanic, Steve Turan, arrived at the alley with his daughters, 6-year-old Paula and 2-year-old Valerie, who he'd been unable to find a babysitter for. The gunmen then opened fire. The gunmen haphazardly set fire to the office, but it didn't burn much. After they left, 12-year-old Melissa was able to call the police, despite being shot 5 times. She and the cook would survive their wounds. Melissa's mother, Stephanie Maack, would initially survive, but would succumb to complications 9 years later. 2-year-old Valerie would survive long enough to be taken to the hospital, but died there. The gunmen have never been identified. After the incident, Stephanie Maack's father, Ronald Maack, who I believe owned the bowling alley and was out of state at the time of the killings, didn't cooperate with authorities. Some believe that the killings might have been a targeted hit in retaliation against Ronald for something he did. Story 10. In my opinion, it's the city of San Francisco train derailment that occurred in Hardin, Nevada on August 12, 1939. The train, run by the Southern Pacific Railroad at the time, derailed at a bridge over the Humboldt River at a speed range of 60 to 90 miles per hour. The accident resulted in 24 fatalities and multiple injuries. Days later, investigators discovered tools at the bottom of the Humboldt River, determining that the wreck was caused by sabotage of the rails. Story 11. Honestly, the Cape Intruder isn't disturbing, just weird as hell. During the night in Cape, Maine, in 2005, people who kept their doors unlocked would wake up to find a man staring at them, and he would quickly flee. No people were ever injured, and nothing was ever stolen. They just watched people sleep. That gave me the creeps. Yikes. With all these horrible things in this thread, that one creeped me out the most. Story 12. Technically not unsolved, since everyone can guess what happened to her, but it's one of the creepiest in my opinion. Alyssa Turney was a teenager who disappeared in 2001. Her stepfather, Michael Turney, was obsessed with her. He stalked her at work, put cameras in the vents to spy on her, and made her sign contracts to say he never her. Michael picked her up from school early on May 17, 2001, and she's never been seen since. Her half-sister, Sarah Turney, has an amazing podcast called Voices for Justice, which explains the case in detail, and because of her, Michael Turney was arrested in August of 2020. She ran away and called only once. The device that records every phone call of the house, it wasn't operating at that specific time. How convenient. Story 13. I remember watching the Unsolved Mysteries episode about a person in 1977 who would send creepy, anonymous letters to random folks in a small town, actually threatening ones too. The sender started by mailing up a woman and telling her, if I remember right, that they knew she was cheating on her husband with a superintendent, something she vehemently denied. Then they threatened her husband by saying he'd be in danger if he didn't stop the affair. The couple decided to take it upon themselves to hunt the sender down. That ended with the husband dead in his crashed pickup truck. The sender kicked the wife while she was down, by leaving threatening signs along her bus route, at least one of which had an actual booby trap on it. They found and arrested a suspect, but it's still unknown today if he's the actual sender. He denies it. The idea that somebody has been quietly studying your life just so they could begin to anonymously blackmail you or make up a rumor to blackmail you with, it's pretty damn scary. Addendum. In 2021, a forensics professional claimed that the police were right all along, and the suspect, who was released by then, was the sender. But the massive hole in her claim is how he was still able to write letters during his time in prison. Story 14. Not necessarily the most creepy or disturbing thing I know of, but it was close to me. A friend I went to school with from 6th to 12th grade was driving home when a car pulled up next to him, and the driver shot him in the head. This was about 7 years ago. No one has any idea why or who the shooter was. No one has ever said anything. He had no enemies, was universally liked, and never hurt anyone. He was 20. Our community is not large. Someone knows something, but has never come forward. Real shame. Had a bright future. Story 15. Just yesterday, my colleague told me a personal account of a kidnapping of her friend. This happened when colleague and her friend were 10 years old. One day, instead of going straight home, as they usually did, they went to the store to buy some candy. When they left the store, some guy stopped them. He started talking to the friend all like, "Your dad sent me to take you home. I've known you since you were a baby. Blah, blah, blah." Heavily paraphrased, but you get the gist of it. So the friend got convinced that he really is there to take her home, so she agreed to go with him. This guy also offered a ride to my colleague as well, but she refused, and so this guy just drives off with the friend. There was a police search and everything. 25 years have passed since then, and no trace of her was ever found. Colleague thinks that he picked her friend specifically because they were athletes at the time, and the school put their photos in the newspaper quite often. Story 16. In my hometown, there is a case of a 16-year-old girl named Chandra May. She was working in 1982, I think at a McDaniels. My mom was getting off her shift early, and Chandra wanted off early instead, so my mom let her swap. She never made it home. Her car was found on her long driveway with the door open. Her purse was open, but nothing was taken. She was found almost a month later hogtied in a lake. She had at least DNA from 2 males. They had kept her hostage for weeks. I may be off on a few facts, but I guess it was so creepy because it was so close to home, and they never found her killers. Story 17. I can't remember his name, but there was a case of a college-age young man, Brian I think is his first name, who was reported missing after a night out. There's security camera footage of him entering a bar, but absolutely no footage of him ever leaving. Like, he went into the bar and just flat out dropped off the face of the earth. The last I knew, he's never been found, and nobody knows what happened to him. Edit. Brian Schaefer, who went missing from Columbus, Ohio. Thanks, Reddit. Also, another edit, since it keeps coming up. The bar was on a 2nd floor at that time with only one public entrance and exit. The police extensively reviewed all of the security camera footage. Brian and everyone else who was there that night was seen on camera entering the bar. Everyone except for Brian, who was at the bar that night, was seen on camera leaving the bar, which would nix any theories that he left wearing different clothes or was disguised as someone else or mixed in with a crowd. Story 18. One case that baffles and fascinates me is that of the Erickson Sisters. They are said to have suffered from a shared psychosis known as folie à deux. But what the heck is that, and what caused it? They're the 40-year-old twin sisters from Sweden who became front-page news in the UK in 2008 when they repeatedly ran into traffic on the M6 motorway. A day or two later, one of them, Sabina, stabbed a man in his home for no apparent reason. She fled the house, striking herself on the head with a hammer as she ran to a highway bridge. She jumped off, falling 12 meters and landing on a highway. She survived with several fractures. I've heard the audio from a TV news crew who happened to capture part of the M6 incident, and just can't forget one of them yelling at her sister about how they'll steal your organs. Whatever happened to them was intense, sudden, and largely unprecedented. Story 19. David Glenn Lewis went missing from Amarillo, Texas on Super Bowl Sunday in 1993. He was an attorney and former judge. His wife and daughter were out of town for the weekend, shopping, and he stayed back. They got back, and the VCR was set to record the game. He had a sandwich made in the fridge, and his wedding ring was next to the sink where he left it when he washed his hands. So they figured out he was there before the game started, as they had to manually set the VCR. Over a decade later, in 2004, a John Doe was connected to him, all the way in Washington state. The circumstances of the then Doe's death: February 1st, 1993, Monday, one day after Lewis was assumed to be home last. A man was walking along Washington 24 at approximately 10:30 p.m. at night. He was fatally struck by a vehicle which fled the scene. He had no ID on him and was wearing what was described as Army surplus clothing. A cold case detective was able to connect it to Lewis in 2004 and give closure to his family. There are so many other details. He told his wife he was in danger but wouldn't explain. Weird tickets were purchased. Money was deposited. His car was found with his ID, wallet, etc. under the floor mats. This is the one I cannot shake from my mind. This is a pretty good short read, but I know there's some great write-ups here on Reddit too. Story 20. The Spy in a Bag Case. The death of MI6 operative Gareth Williams, whose decomposing corpse was found zipped into a locked duffel bag in the bathtub on his flat. The key to the padlock was inside the bag under his body. There are many theories that he had been investigating Russian money laundering and tax fraud and paid the price. However, the police concluded that no one else was present at the time of death. There were no fingerprints or DNA found on the bathtub, including his own. It's a very strange story. Story 21. The Ghost Ship of the Mary Celeste. It was an American merchant brigantine, discovered adrift and deserted in the Atlantic Ocean on December 4, 1872. Ship's cargo was intact, and the captain's and crew's personal belongings were undisturbed. None of the 10 people who had been on board, including Captain Briggs, his wife, and their 2-year-old daughter, were ever seen or heard from again. Story 22. Jack the Ripper. There's a few victims compared to other cases. However, the way it was done was horrible. It's a mystery unsolved since 1888, and it most likely never will be. When you know that during that time London smelled, was hidden by a thick fog, everything was dirty, and the people all struggled despite the industrial boom. Imagine being from the lowest class ever, knowing a serial killer is outside, and you literally have nothing to protect you. The policemen were useless. It happened quickly, and the killer disappeared. It put London in terror. Story 23. The Disappearances of Felipe Santos and Terrence Williams. 2 men go missing after being arrested by the same deputy within 3 months. He claims he dropped them off at Circle K stores, but his stories are inconsistent. They haven't been found since. My dad, who had gotten his green card a few months before, was terrified of getting pulled over by the cops since he was working in the same area. Story 24. The one who put Bella in the Wych Elm case. During or around World War II, a woman somehow ends up in a wych elm. She is then found years later by some kids playing in the woods after the tree had grown around her corpse. No one knows who she was or why she was in the tree, if she was from the nearby town or if she was a spy, as her death was probably in World War II. Yet, sometime later, strange graffiti messages started showing up, asking the question, who put Bella in the wych elm? Hence the case's name, although the victim's name is probably not Bella. Story 25. The Hinterk Murders. A farmer in Germany back in the 1920s had noticed mysterious footprints in the snow around his house. There was also strange stuff happening around the farm, footsteps in the attic, a newspaper that no one in the family had bought, and eventually the house keys disappeared. What makes it stranger is that the housekeeper had left a few months prior, swearing up and down that the farm was haunted. The family suddenly went unseen for a couple of days. Their neighbors went to check on them, only to find the entire family, as well as their newly hired housekeeper, had been assassinated. Most of the family had been led into the barn one by one and slaughtered with what's believed to have been a pickaxe. The maid and her youngest son were killed in their beds. The worst part is that the youngest daughter lived for a few hours after the attack. She spent the last few hours of her life lying next to her dead family in the hay of the barn, and had torn chunks of her own hair out in that time. Despite the best efforts of the police, they never found out who assassinated the family. Whoever it was stayed in the house after the murders. The neighbor saw smoke coming from the chimney, and some of the food had been eaten. Still, 100 years after the murders, no one really knows who did it. Story 26. The aerial school landings in Zimbabwe. 60-plus school children saw crafts landing and beings coming out of them. The kids interacted with the beings. They were put under evaluation by a Harvard psychiatrist. They all told virtually the same story and drew the same drawings. It was concluded that they were telling the truth. Story 27. Former child actor Joe Pickler, Varsity Blues, Beethoven's Third and Fourth, went missing from his hometown of Bremerton, Washington in January of 2006. His car was found abandoned behind a Mexican restaurant, but no trace of him has ever been found. Story 28. Michael Dunahee, little 4-year-old boy at the park with his parents, and with multiple witnesses around, suddenly disappears into thin air and is never seen or heard from again. Even though he was within meters of both of his parents and a playground full of people, nobody saw anything, and to this day, his disappearance remains completely unsolved.